Hello, Comm 110. Welcome to the first ever Ask Me Anything YouTube video by me. I took your questions this week. I think this is something that I want to do early on in the semester. It's something I'm trying for the first time. So thank you for submitting your questions, and you'll get your bonus points. Also, I just want to say great work and thanks for a great semester so far. I'm really looking forward to digging into your speeches. We've worked through that process with drafts. Your content's there. So now I'm just really excited to see how you perform it. So I'll start doing those as soon as I can. There's just a lot of stuff coming in right now at the end of the semester. It's already a day behind in getting this video out just because of everything. And I'm on a dean search, but it's wrapping up really quickly. So I will do my best. I will just be grading every day from now throughout next week, and you'll be seeing things, and I'll send out an email when it's ready. So to keep this video a little bit on the short side, or as short as possible, I'm going to go through your questions and answer them as best as I possibly can, and as honestly as I possibly can, as both a human and a teacher. So if we get into that, I can always differentiate if I need to. So the first question comes from Katie, and it was, I'm just curious, what has been your most memorable demonstration speech thus far in your career? That one is super hard because I've seen so many. And so, it's, and I don't want this to be a cop-out, okay? And I want to say I don't necessarily have a favorite, but I will say that most of the demonstration speeches in some way affects decisions that I make in my life or things that I know how to do, or I just find super interesting. I can even think of, for one example, it was about how to bag groceries. And one tip they taught in the demonstration speech is that when you have a paper bag with the handles on it, that you're supposed to turn the inside handle out, which I never did, and it's supposed to make the handle stronger and not from breaking. And that was something that I always took with me. And so, over time, some of them fade, but I think it's something that's also very powerful for you to realize that the things that you choose to speak about have effect on me and effect on your classmates and can really, move change, even on this smaller scale. So I wish I had a better answer for you on that one. Okay, the next question was from Dominique, and I kind of answered this, and it was about children with nonverbal. You can read this in the discussion. I did leave her a comment saying, think about if you're having trouble. I did work with kids back in the day. This isn't a professional diagnosis, and I don't want to kind of get into that territory, but I will say that if you're having a problem in transition areas, and the question's long, so I just didn't want to quite read it. If you're having problems in transition areas, think about consistency and things that you can do to keep that consistency. Like I suggested, a necklace with signs on it, or, I think the girl that I used to work with, she had a board that she could carry with, that she could give. It was like Velcro on it, and you could give stuff. So, okay, next question. Joe asks, through the many presentations and speeches that I have had to give during high school and college, an issue has always been nerves. Happens to me too. I always found myself shaking regardless how well I know the material. The only solution I have found is to move around while giving a speech. So my question is, does moving around during a speech detract from the presentation? Is it better to be loose and move during a speech, or should I find other ways to deal with my nerves? And there was a follow-up question by Dominique, who seconded this. And so I'll kind of address both of those questions. So, nerves are so common. It is, I think somebody who doesn't experience nerves is very rare, right? I think in these instances, when you are talking about speeches, so I know for myself, when I get in front of a group of people, now, and now, like a classroom might not be the same, but if I have to, at awards ceremony, or if I have to get up and talk, my hands shake, and it's just kind of uncontrollable. And if you watch that video that flight or flight mechanism, you realize it's out of your control in some ways, except for if, deep perception and just getting used to it and rewriting that in your mind. So my advice is to use what your natural inclination is. So if your natural inclination is to move, but do it purposefully. So that's my natural inclination when I'm in front of an audience. If I want to move, like this being right here in front of you is kind of hard. My natural stance is probably a little bit more loose, and I'd probably be moving around a lot more. But because of the camera and the framing, I'm doing everything in my ability possible to stay here and try to not have my hands too much going here and here and here. So depending on the format, really is if the format allows for it and calls for it. So very few times do you actually have to stand behind a podium. But when you do think about moving, you want to maybe get a second opinion. Am I moving too much? Is my movement distracting? That's really the question here. And I think a really good technique for moving is even within your speech, if you want to mark a place and it says take a step. And you do this on transitions, for example. So let's say, you bring up your first point and then you say, and it says in your script, take a step. So our next step that we need to consider, and maybe it's 2 steps, and maybe you just move to a certain place in the room. But on those transitions is when you can step. It's a little awkward with this thing. But use what is natural to you. If you try to like stay rigid behind that, you're fighting an urge when your natural energy wants to do something else. So it's about utilizing your natural tendencies, being aware of them, and then being conscious. So I know that when I used to speak in high school, I was on the speech team, and I had no idea why at the time. But when I would speak, I would always be doing this. It was my kind of natural, my gesture, I'm talking and doing it was this natural thing, and I kept getting the comments, and then they finally told us, or said, okay, we're going to tape our performances, and then we'll watch them. And I could see this. I was doing this every time. And what I ended up doing was grabbing 2 chairs and holding them by my sides for a speech. And it really made me mindful of what my arms were doing, that I couldn't, lift up. And as you get into those spaces, especially when you're nervous, just remember, the only thing you can control is right here, and your body is reacting. And if you can remember that it's not you, but it's your body, you can kind of work with that and get that natural, you can give yourself that natural forgiveness. Oh, I'm nervous, and so things are coming out a little weird. You can make fun of it. Or if you move, just say, you know what, I really like to move a lot. I'm very excited. So, and this will kind of lead into the next question. So don't ignore your natural impulses. People like an active person, a lively person in front of them. So as long as the situation calls for it, I'd use it and just be mindful. Now, Janet asks, I find that when I give a speech that I tend to talk too fast. How do I slow myself down so that others can keep up with what I'm saying? It's not that I'm trying to get it over with, or maybe I am. Okay, this is my problem too. In fact, when I was thinking about your question, I realized I was voted turbo talker in high school. So that's always been my struggle, is going fast. How do you get over that? You have to be aware that you have a tendency to speak fast. In my oral interpretation class, I think one thing that's really beneficial is we record ourselves telling stories, and then we listen back to it, and we do our self-critique and things like that. But as you learn your own voice, so I did this in a podcast. I was in a podcast, and so I had to do a lot of editing, and I got used to the sound of my own voice. And as you can learn to listen and think about your own voice, the more control you're going to have over it. And if you know that you go fast, look for the times, like even right now as I'm talking, look for the times when you can take a pause And maybe that's asking a question, letting things hang, and just knowing maybe also that you, and differentiating, I should say, as to whether or not you're talking fast because you don't like silence. Silence is good in a speech. If you read or if you watched the video talking about removing your ahs and ums, a lot of it just has to do with having the ability to just pause when you don't know what you're going to say next, or if you're thinking about what you're going to say next. Make sure in your script, I would always mark pause, slow down, take a breath, reset. And the best way to do it, and this happened to me even this semester when I was recording audiobooks for this class, I would read the book, and I'd listen back. And you can hear this probably from the beginning of the class to the end. As I listen back, I go, oh, I was going way too fast on that. Or just it needs to slow down just to beat, or just to whatnot. And I'd listen back. And so each time I was practicing, trying to slow down just a little bit. And you can only do that by observing yourself. You can record yourself with the cell phone. And sometimes it's uncomfortable, but I swear to God, if you do it a few times, you get used to it. And it just makes life a little bit easier. So work on being conscious of your language, not being afraid to pause and let things sit. And a really easy trick is to just ask a question to an audience. And then when you ask a question, and this was advice from my mentor, it takes people 15 seconds to be able to answer a question. It was something like that. And it was, first they got to think about their answer, how they'd phrase it, what the reaction from other people would be, and then time to answer. So count out loud if you're going to ask a question so that you're not rushing those questions as well. Okay. Like I said, I want to try to keep this as short as possible. We're already at 12 minutes. All right. I think, okay. This is from Sydney. I'm curious, how do you like being a distance learning teacher? Do you prefer it? How many classes do you teach online each semester? I want to be a teacher, and by the time I get there, I assume a lot more of it will be online. And as a student, I really enjoy it. Let me know your thoughts. I really, really like being a distance learning teacher. In fact, I kind of made the transition from on campus to just DL. And I like the challenge of it. And there's a lot of challenge in terms of figuring out the D2 out, or the learning management tool. Here's the tough part. The learning management tool, and making it easy enough and utilizing the technology so that way I can get the technology out of the way for you to learn. The best part about it is if you have an imagination, you can really start to do some really interesting things. Like, I think the YouTube video for this class is something that we wouldn't be able to, well, we could do in the classroom, but because of the format, creating your YouTube videos is a type of presentation, but it's probably one that you're going to be giving a lot in the future. And having the skills to be able to frame your video and to put it up online, and just to know that you can start your own YouTube channel tomorrow now. You have the skills, the speeches, the presentations, the rules are the same. And so yes, I really do love it. I love, there's some limitations and things that I'm always trying to figure out ways to get around. I'd like the discussions to be more natural. We're going to Canvas, and I think that'll help. So some of the tools, it's just figuring out the tools. But I love the work that DL students put in. It's a different type of interaction where I'm reading your thoughts and reading your discussions with your classmates and commenting, and so it's just navigating the balance, I think, is always the tough part with that, but I do really like it. And each semester as we wrap up and I read your final papers, it's very, very rewarding. So Sarah asks, hey, Scott, I was wondering if you had any tips on becoming a better conversationalist, especially for someone who is somewhat of an introvert. I have some friends that are so good at carrying on a conversation with anyone, and this is something that I would like to get better at. It seems basic, but it is really an incredibly useful skill. So I'll just stop the question there, but I'll say this. I think the easiest way to become a better conversationalist. I'm a little bit of an introvert. We did the scale, the introvert extrovert scale, the Myers Briggs test, and I used to be an E, and now I think I would probably be more of an introvert. The best way to be a conversationalist, it's the simplest thing in the world, is just ask questions. So if you find yourself in a room, I was in a room with the chancellor and the provost of the university, and it's hard to make conversation with somebody you don't know really well. So it's you know you can ask a question about something, or how's your morning going, and you can just continually with people ask follow-up questions and get people to talk. And I think what happens is if you can kind of disarm people a little bit in terms of making conversations, whether it's a grocery store or whatever, something always happens, and maybe you feel this way too. Is when you start to interact with somebody, you start to have this conversation, you feel this kind of awkward mismatch of like you say something, oh, is that just this weird like little negotiation. I don't know if it just happens to me, but in those moments, somebody says something, asking a question, or if they say something, yeah, da da da, you can ask a follow up question to it, or oh yeah, what do you think about that? Or I think being a conversationalist doesn't mean talking necessarily about yourself, and I think if you could just ask a couple questions as you get into 2 or 3 questions in, conversation starts to become really natural. So I think it's a way of doing that without going out there on a limb, well, sure is a nice day, right? Isn't it? That's a question instead of, wow, it's a nice day out. Make it into a question. Ask follow up. Oh, wow, that's awesome. Did you, was that a lot of fun? You know what I mean? When somebody talks, you'll be surprised. You can get people to talk without talking about yourself very, very rarely. So, but I think that would help ease into those conversations. And I think that I did have one more piece come in, and one more question. I'm going to read it off the other thing. If you could give one piece of advice that you think a college student or young person should know, what would it be? I think that probably I'm going to go 2 things. I think one, you're more like everyone else than you are different. So I remember as a college student, and even now, like in life, right? You see people, and you can see differences. Like I might not get along with this person, or you find yourself in a room with these different personalities, and but if you remember, you have more in common than you have that's different. It's so much more easy to relate to people. And more importantly, I think, is that you do have a voice, and you have a voice that matters. And so any chances that you get to make that voice heard. I mean, I think even in a class like this with, our speeches, the speeches we choose are going to affect and be viewed by our classmates, which are going to have some change. And you might have places where your voice maybe doesn't have the biggest impact, maybe the biggest audience, but even a small audience can make changes. And you are an expert at your own life and your own experiences. And so by being honest and kind of vulnerable at times and just saying, well, this is my experience, without treading on other people, I think it's really important. I felt like when I was younger, I didn't feel like I necessarily had that voice, or I needed to, find what it was, but it's always there. It's just trusting in it a little bit more, I think. So as you go through college, and I want to make assumptions because this is a 110 class, and so it's usually one that's at the beginning of college career. When you do assignments, and you do stuff, my advice is to try to do it. So sorry. Try to do it so you are getting the most exploration out of your thoughts and not necessarily going after the right answer. That's really critical thinking. It's to dive in and just engage your interests. But so, thank you for the Ask Me Anything questions. I hope to incorporate them in the future. I hope you have a great end of your semester. And I look forward to digging into your speeches and seeing what you wrote about for your final papers. So, have a good week, everybody.